One South Dakota lawmaker wants to cut property taxes for South Dakota homeowners in half in the future. The Legislative Task Force for Comprehensive Property Tax came together in Pierre this week, and during the meeting, State Representative John Hansen brought up the idea of cutting property taxes of homeowners by at least 50%. Hansen reminded the members the task force was created through a resolution that passed in the legislature, and the team serves the purpose of overseeing a review of state property tax policies and find ways to provide substantial and long-term tax relief. South Dakota Senator Randy Dibert says cutting property taxes by at least 50% is a lofty goal.
We're looking at somewhere between $450 million and $700 million to replace that lost revenue. So that's pretty lofty. You know, we look at last year trying to cut the state budget a few $1 million, about $6 million, and we didn't get that done.
Dibert says some of the formulas and the ways state taxes are determined are outdated and need to be revisited.